This week we are going to look at this very short passage from the beginning of the book of Luke. And I do apologize in advance. The version of it I'm using is actually from the ESV, so the translation is going to be a little bit different than what we just read. But we're going to do something a little odd. It's maybe not odd, very old-fashioned. We're just kind of go through this verse by verse, phrase by phrase, bit by bit, to make sure we understand what exactly is Luke saying here in this short introduction to the gospel. Because it's an important gospel. Not only because it is the gospel of Luke teaching us about the life and the acts and the works of our Lord Jesus Christ, but also because it's meant as a pair, right? We're not just given Luke, we're given this pair of texts, Luke and Acts, which tell us the whole story combined of the early church, from the birth of Christ, actually from before the birth of Christ, up until the imprisonment of Paul in Rome. So this covers about a 60-year period of time, more or less. So we want to go through this bit by bit, piece by piece, so we can understand kind of what's going on here. And also to give some context, to understand Luke is writing this letter, essentially, this text, this work, as he calls it, an orderly account, in a context, right? There's a historical moment when this happens, and we want to think about exactly when that was. So, I'm going to go ahead and I'll read through it one more time very quickly. This will be the version that I use throughout the sermon today, and then we're going to go through it kind of step by step by step. So Luke 1:1-4, once more. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all these things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. So this is how Luke opens up his text, his document. And we can tell a couple things, or there is some kind of questions about when does this happen, when does this come from, where does Luke fit in with all of this? I went and made this myself. I couldn't find a good one that visualized the overlap of the lives of these early church leaders, so I went ahead and made one myself to kind of fit it. So if you look up here, I realize it's very small. I apologize. If you look, did we die? Did we die? Am I blocking it? Oh, we died. If you look up at the very top, that's Luke, and there's some question about when exactly he was born. He was either born in the year 1, the year 16. We're not really sure where exactly. And you may think, well, why don't we know that? Well, largely it's because that like 99% of all written documents that were ever created in the Roman Empire didn't survive, right? So it's not that no one knew, it's just it didn't make it, right? So somewhere in that early period, but we do know he lives 84 years, right? We know that that's about how long he lives. And you can see he has this substantial amount of overlap with these early church fathers, right? People like Ignatius and Clement, these early fathers of the church. Other ones like Papias and Polycarp. And then one of the first people who actually specifically refers to the Gospel of Luke. Not only refers to the existence of Gospels, but that the Gospel that Luke wrote is Irenaeus, right here. Who lived a little bit later than Luke, but we see that he has substantial overlap with Polycarp, because Polycarp's the one who baptizes him, who lived at the same time that Luke did. So we see that there's this kind of seamless transition through these early church fathers that we know quite a bit about. And all of them lived within a very interesting historical period. That this is the context in which we find Luke writing these letters, right? It's not that Luke is writing them in 15th century Europe, right? This isn't in the middle of the Holy Roman Empire where everyone is ostensibly Christian. Luke is writing these at a time when the church is very, very small. It's not only small, but it's also it's under an incredible amount of pressure, right? There are even some theories that the reason Luke put these two accounts together was to provide a document to defend Paul in his trial. Now, we don't have any way of telling if that's true. It's kind of a fringe theory, but that's the time period that he's writing these, right? If you remember at the very end of Acts, we aren't told that Paul dies. Right? It goes up to his imprisonment in Rome. He arrives in Rome, and that's where the story ends. Right? So this is very early on in the church. This is very early on also in the history of the Roman Empire. So Luke is writing this at a very particular point in time. It's at the very end of the reign of Nero. This is a little bit after that. Nero was such a bad emperor that after he died, everything kind of fell apart for a short period of time. This is known as the period of the four emperors. This is from 69. Luke probably wrote this a little bit earlier than that. But because we know Paul's death comes at about 64 or 65, right? He's right at the end of the reign of the Emperor Nero. And after Nero, the empire is broken up into it's controlled by four different people. They kind of go to war with each other, and as happens over and over and over again in Rome, they fight, someone wins, Rome goes back to being unified. But this is where we find Luke writing. So Luke is writing during middle of Roman history, early in the Roman Empire. The Republic has transitioned into an empire. Luke is writing this letter, but this is not the height of Roman power, right? Luke is writing this letter while Rome is still very much on the way up, right? Rome is going to get more and more powerful from here. It was powerful under Augustus, but after his line fails, you have the period of the five emperors. And some 60 years after Luke is done writing this text, this is when Rome is at its furthest extent. And during this whole period, this is what the map of the Roman Empire looked like under the Emperor Trajan. Which is the most territory that Rome controlled during its history was under the reign of Trajan. So Luke is writing before Rome has reached its most powerful, right? And the thing we know all through that period, all through Rome's rise and through much of its early dominance, is that this was a pretty bad time for Christians, individually. Right? It was great for the Christian church. The church grew and expanded all throughout the empire. But this was a really difficult time for Christians. We know that is true of the period that Paul is involved in. When we look at Acts later on, that when Luke ends his tale, we see this mostly as the persecution of the leaders in Jerusalem of Paul. But what transitions after that is it goes from being a persecution being largely a problem in Jerusalem to being a Roman problem, right? That it isn't the Jewish leadership that has Paul killed, it's the Roman emperor, right? That Paul dies under the persecutions of Nero. And this became kind of a very standard part of the Christian story around the time that Luke's writing. It begins with Nero, and then it kind of comes back every couple of decades. You have the persecutions under Nero, you have the persecutions under Decius, under Valerian, under Diocletian, and that's when they end, right? Because not too long after that, you have Constantine, right? And if you know much of your history of the Christian church, this is a signal moment because Christianity goes from being persecuted to tolerated and actually somewhat supported. But Constantine rises to power in the year around the 320s, right? I think the Battle of Milvian Bridge is around 325. That's 200 years after Trajan. That's 250 years after Luke's written this. So Luke is not writing this history into a moment of pure triumph. He's writing this into a context of incredible, incredible difficulty, right? Paul is in prison. The Christians everywhere are persecuted. This is a difficult, difficult time. That's the background in which Luke's writing this, which is a helpful kind of reminder. But not just the persecutions, it's also the height of Roman glory is when he's writing this. That there's a certain style, a certain background to all of that. And that becomes important, right? That becomes incredibly important to the Christian story because Rome was good at a few things. One of them was conquering neighboring peoples, right? And losing armies. They were fantastically good at this. The other thing they were incredibly good at was building public works, right? And we know some of them, right? You've seen pictures of the Colosseums. You've probably seen pictures of the triumphal arches, which are 2,000 years old and look like they were built like 50 years ago. The other thing, though, that they were incredibly, incredibly good at building was roads. Romans were incredibly good road builders. So much so that some of their roads still exist and are used throughout Europe, which was really important, because know what makes it really easy to share the gospel? Transportation. And back then, you couldn't, you're not going to get on a plane, you might get on a boat. You wouldn't get on a bus, none of that stuff. Largely, you'd have to walk. And it makes it really, really easy if you can walk the roads without harassment. And that's what Rome had provided. So not all of what Rome throws into this story is negative, right? It allows for Paul to move from place to place. It allows for Luke to move from place to place, which is going to be important to what he tells us about what it is he is trying to do with this thing that he's written. Right? Because at the time, we didn't call them Gospels. We didn't have that word yet. That's something we call it later. This thing that he's written, that we will come to know as a gospel, what is he trying to do? So from the very beginning, he tells us what the motivation for what he's doing actually is. And this entire first 4 verses are actually one very well-crafted, very complicated sentence. Not only in the English, but in the Greek as well. Luke was a very learned person. His Greek is probably the best written Greek in the entire New Testament. He's incredibly good. He's very learned. He is a good scholar. We can tell from his writings. And he starts out with, many have undertaken to compile a narrative. And that may strike us as a pretty kind of bland thing to say, right? Other people have tried to write this. Right? But the reminder here is that means that Luke knew that other people were writing stories about the life of Christ. Which we know is true because we've got them in our Bible, right? We've got Mark and Matthew and John, the other Gospels outside of the one that Luke wrote. But what this tells us is that Luke himself, at the time that he's writing this, most likely again in the 60s, knew of the existence of these other Gospels, right? He knew that there were other people in the movement, in the Christian movement, who were attempting to do the same thing, to put together an account, or to write something about this story about who Christ was and what he did. Certainly Mark, most likely Matthew, and possibly even John, although there's a lot of debate about when exactly John wrote his Gospel. A narrative of what, though? A narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. And this seems like a simple statement, but there's a lot going on here. Both because the word he uses here for accomplished means accomplished, but it also has that sense of being fulfilled, right? Being brought to completion. Now, we know the church hasn't been brought to completion, right? Because he's going to write the history of that, and when he ends that history, it's very open-ended, right? He's saying, this is how we've started, but he knows it's going to go out from there. What is it that's been accomplished? What is it that's been fulfilled? Well, what we know about the life of Christ is that fulfillment is a powerful part of Jesus' story. He fulfills the promises of the Old Testament. He fulfills the purpose of the temple. He fulfills the work of salvation that God has been bringing about since the fall of Adam. But he also is saying this not among us. And one of the things we also suspect about Luke, we're not 100% sure, but we suspect it is true, particularly in the way that he writes this gospel, is that Luke was probably a Gentile. Luke was not Jewish. Luke was outside of the what we would think of as the original chosen people. So if that's true, that us is an incredibly powerful thing. That it has been accomplished among us, among the Jews, the Gentiles, the church that is being born here in this moment in history that Luke is experiencing. And that's a powerful reminder that the gospel of Christ moves the chosenness out of a single people and moves it to all of us. Every single one of us sitting in here, right? If we were sitting there in, pre-Jesus Rome, we would be outside the covenant people. By virtue of our birth, we would be outside the covenant people. We could become, what would they call them? I'm forgetting the word they used. Proselytes, what they call them. Anyway, you could kind of somewhat enter into some of the practices of Judaism at that time, but you couldn't really be part of the chosen people. But that changes with Christ. It brings all of us in to that work of accomplishment, that work of fulfillment. So what Luke is trying to do here is he's saying people have already started to try to put together an account of what happened, how we got to this point where these things are accomplished among us. And it's not only the accomplishment of what Christ does, because we know again that there's a second book, right? There's a second book. That Luke also, we know, is the author of Acts. He titles it almost the same way. In the first book, the Gospel of Luke, O Theophilus, I've dealt with all that Jesus began to do and to teach until the day when he was taken up. And then he moves into the story of how that leads into the birth of the church. So when he's saying among us, this is including his second work, his second history as well. Now, because Luke is trying to compile a history, it's important to know, well, who is he relying on? What is he basing this on? How do we know we can trust the things that he's teaching us? He says that just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. So Luke's taking on a model here, right? He's mimicking someone. He's doing the same thing as what he has already seen. He's saying that we received this, he himself, the churches that he's been a part of, we received this from eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. They delivered it to us, so now I am putting together something so that I can deliver it to you. Right? And he tells us, again, these two particular people, these two groups. Eyewitnesses. Right? People who were there and saw it. Now, Luke is pretty clear that he was not an eyewitness, right? Not to the Gospel of Luke. He is in Acts. You've probably noticed this at times when you're reading through the book of Acts. All of a sudden it goes from they to we. Suddenly the author is kind of popped into the story. And we know that's true of Luke himself, right? In many of Paul's letters, Paul makes mention of Luke as one of his companions, that he was there with him when he wrote the letter to Philemon. He was there with him when he wrote one of the letters to Timothy. So the we makes sense because Luke pops into that story. But when it comes to the life and experiences and teachings of Christ, Luke wasn't there. He wasn't one of the eyewitnesses. But he knew them. He met them. And the sense that we get from what we read in the rest of Luke's gospel is not only did he didn't just accidentally meet them, but it seems like he actively went looking for them, went to find them and to understand their story, to get very detailed accounts of what they did and experienced and said and heard. So that eyewitnesses are going to be an important part of his account. That he's met these people. He is not the eyewitness, but he has talked to them, he's understood their stories. Which, if any of you have ever studied history before, you know this is important. We always divide sources into two types, primary and secondary sources. Right? Secondary sources are not quite as good because they weren't really there. Primary sources, much better, that people actually saw the thing. So here he's got his primary sources covered, right? But he also mentions this other group of people, ministers of the word. And actually the other translation we read earlier kind of gets at another important meaning to this word ministers. It means ministers in the sense of someone who takes part in like the execution of a process or an activity. But it can also be translated as a servant, right? A servant of the word. And it was very often used to refer to the attendants who worked within the temple. The ones who would go and grab the scrolls in which the scriptures were written down to help lay them out and unfold them so that people could read for them. People who helped serve within the temple. But we want to be careful here to not underestimate how strong of a statement he's making here. So these are his secondary sources, right? These are the ministers of the word, the people who are teaching the things that the eyewitnesses experienced, who are teaching to others the teachings of Christ. We want to be careful, though, about the word that he uses here at the end. So that the ministers of the word. Now, this can mean a message, right? A spoken word. It's the word logos. You've probably heard this before. The word logos in Greek could mean just that someone spoke, right? They speak a word, that word is the logos. But logos is also a very philosophically deep concept. An incredibly philosophically deep concept. It's one that not only was it philosophically important in Greek philosophy before the birth of Christ, but it takes on a very important context and content within Christian theology. It's the same exact word that they use for word here in the early verses of John, where John says, in the beginning was the Word. He's saying the Logos, right? This is a term that would mean kind of a principle of truth in the world, right? That it's not just spoken words, but it's an underlying kind of fundamental truth about the reality of our existence. And in John 1, John is specifically tying that to a person. He's saying that word, that logos that you've heard about in Greek philosophy, isn't something that you can't know about. It's a person. It's Jesus Christ. That's who this is. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then we get down to verse 14 where it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. As if there was any confusion about who exactly John's talking about. Now, unfortunately, this translates really badly into English, right? We only have Word. Word has no philosophical meaning to it in English. It's just kind of a bland, everyday term. The Chinese translation of this passage is actually way better. It's significantly better because it starts out and says, in the beginning was the Dao, like Dao Lu. And Dao is a deeply philosophical term in the Chinese language, which fits much better with the concept of logos. Unfortunately, in this case, English is a little bit more impoverished. But when Luke is talking about ministers of the Word, he's saying these are servants of Christ. These are people who are on behalf of Christ, who are bringing this word of salvation to others. So Luke has talked to the eyewitnesses. He has talked to people whose lives are dedicated to the service of that gospel message. And that he is using that in the construction of this account. And he says, they are the ones who have given these things to us, right? It's the eyewitnesses, it's the ministers of the Word who have told us about what Christ has done. And now, again, we know that Luke is trying to do the same thing, develop an account that he can then give to others. But Luke says he's been following all these things closely for some time past. Which means that it's not that he woke up one day and was like, you know what, I'm going to write a story, right? I like this Jesus guy, I've been hanging out with Paul, I'm going to write a story. I was reading a note just recently that this is the, what would you call it, the running theory kind of on how Mark put together the Gospel of Mark. That Mark traveled with Peter, and that he was his kind of scribe or attendant. So Peter would preach and teach, and Mark's on the side like writing down all this stuff that he's saying. And eventually, after doing that time and time again, he's got all these notes. He's like, okay, I can put together a gospel now. So it's not, Mark isn't giving his own account. Mark is giving Peter's account of what he had seen. And Luke is doing a similar thing here, right? At minimum, he's been traveling with Paul. But we know that when he travels with Paul, he's also meeting other people. He's likely met Peter. He's been to the church in Jerusalem. He's been through many of these important places. And we know that he's been following these things very closely because unlike many of the other Gospels, Luke has incredibly detailed accounts, not only about what Jesus says, right? Many of the Gospels have that, right? They recount similar teachings, similar parables. All the Gospels have detailed accounts of what Jesus himself said and did. Luke has detailed accounts about what everyone else said and did. So it's in Luke that we get the most detailed accounts of John the Baptist. It's in Luke that we get the most detailed accounts of things like Mary's prayer. Right? The Magnificat is in the Gospel of Luke. And you can imagine that Luke went and looked up Mary and was like, what was that like? Angel shows up in your room, tells you you're going to give birth to the Son of God. What happened? And she's like, I'm glad you asked. I prayed. And here's the prayer. Here's the prayer as I remember it. Luke writes that down. But it's not just Mary's prayer. It's Zechariah's prophecy, the father of John the Baptist. Luke is where we find the detailed account of that prophecy as well. So when Luke says that he has been following these things closely for some time past, he has been a very, very diligent historian. He has been doing the hard work of looking up the primary sources. So who are the eyewitnesses? Well, he might not have talked to Zechariah himself, because Zechariah was old when this happened, so he's probably very dead by the time Luke was writing this. But he went to find someone who knew about this. Maybe Elizabeth. His wife was a bit younger. Maybe it was Mary. Maybe Mary had held on to these things, right? It's like, I don't know if moms in other places do this, but like moms in the U.S. are like, anytime anything happens that is like about their children that's really good, they save every little detail. Right? I've gone back and seen my mom's, like, we call them scrapbooks, literally because they have scraps in them. Scraps of newspaper, scraps of, like, little things you made in class. You can imagine Mary's doing the same thing, right? She hears Zechariah pray this prophecy about her child and is like, I'm going to write that down. Someone write that down for me. I'm keeping that. So maybe this came from Mary. I can definitely imagine that. But Luke has done the hard work of gathering up all these little bits and pieces of detail. And it's why in Luke we find the most kind of historically sound and crafted account. Well, why is that? Because that's exactly what he set out to do. Right? Some of the other Gospels, they don't really have the sense of being a chronological history. Right? Not that they're non-chronological, but we don't get the sense that the purpose is the chronology. The birth is at the front, the death and resurrection are at the end, but everything in the middle is kind of teachings, miracles, stuff like that, right? The order kind of matters, but kind of doesn't matter, right? It's telling us who Jesus is, not necessarily telling us in detail he went from step A to step B to step C, not what they're trying to do. Luke, however, seems to be doing this. And it's why he jumps across stories within his timeline. Jesus was doing this over here, and then over here on the other side, John the Baptist was doing this, until the point that John dies, is executed by Herod, and then John drops out of the story. And it's all just Jesus from there on out. But Luke has these kind of parallel histories running at the beginning of his account. And it's because he's trying to do exactly this. He's trying to put together an orderly account. Now, this might sound like it's one of these kind of meaningless statements that needs a little bit of context. We might think, well, this doesn't necessarily mean that Luke's a historian. Well, I think it means that Luke thought of himself as a historian. And this was a long and storied practice within Rome and within Greece. In the U.S. and in many parts of Europe, our educational system used to start out with what we would call classics in the classical period. Right? And there's still places where you can take what is called a classical education. And almost without exception, classical educations are going to start with a few different books. Right? You're going to encounter very, very quickly Herodotus and Thucydides. Herodotus was a historian who writes the histories. Thucydides is the one who writes the history of the Peloponnesian War. This was something that was very, very, very common in the Greco-Roman world. That every couple of years you would get someone who would sit down and write this massive historical account, right? So you had figures like Herodotus in his books. Much of what we know about the early Roman, about the Republic and the early Roman Empire comes out of the histories written by Livy. Now, we don't even have all of them. He wrote volume after volume after volume of these things, and many of them did not survive the ravages of history, right? Again, something like 99% of all literature that we had in the Roman Empire just does not make it to today. Part of that is, war, disaster, things like that. Some of it is the fact that they wrote it on really flimsy papyrus, and that stuff doesn't last very long unless you store it really well. It's also, Mediterranean, it can get a little humid here. Living here in Taiwan, you guys know what humidity does to paper. It's not friendly. So if it's not stored well, you're lucky if paper lasts 10 years, let alone 1,000 years, let alone 2,000 years. So very little makes it. But this was a very common practice, right? And it moves on into the Byzantine Empire, famous historical accounts like those by Procopius. And it was true of the church also. Luke is not the only one who does this, right? We have multiple figures within the early Christian church who this is what we know them for, right? So early on within the church, I think around 350, you have Eusebius who writes his ecclesiastical history of the church in Rome up until the period that he's writing. You have the Venerable Bede, who's one of the most famous kind of historical writers in Britain, and he writes an ecclesiastical history of Britain, from the Romans on up until what was his present day. So this practice of historical writing was not something that we invented in modern universities, right? Historical writing was a long tradition, even by the time that Luke is writing his history. So when he says, I'm going to sit down and write an orderly account for you, he had models, right? He had examples of what this looked like. He knew that the way that you do this is you talk to the people who experienced it, you talk to those who knew about it, who were there, you compile notes and all these documents, and you put the account together the best that you can. So this wasn't kind of like on a whim, right? Luke is very clearly seeing himself as part of this historical process. And he's got a reader, right? He's writing this to someone. We saw this name already in that quick reference to Acts as well, that both Luke and Acts are addressed to what seems to be an individual person, Theophilus. Now, it is a bit unclear who exactly this was actually written to, right? There's speculation that Theophilus might have been it's not the judge, obviously. There's speculation that it might have been an early bishop. It's speculation that it might have been a recent either Jewish or kind of Roman noble convert. There's a lot of speculation about who this person might have been. We just frankly don't know. Some people even speculate that there was no person, right? That the reason Luke uses this term Theophilus is that if you know the Greek here, Theophilos is like to love God, right? Philo is the word for love. Theo is the word for God. It's where we get the term Deus, same exact term. So it's often translated as like the friend of God, written to this person. So we're not quite sure whether this was an individual person. But even if it is, even if there was a person by this name, or at least title, that Luke was writing this to, how fitting, right? How fitting that his recipient would have a name like this. Because by being named in this way, where you can interpret this name, read the meaning of the name as a friend of God, it's something that we can engage with very directly, right? I can see this as written to me. You can read this as written to you. Whether or not there was someone intended, the happenstance of this is that we can read this as directly addressed to us. Which means that the purpose behind it, the purpose for why Luke has written it, is also directed to us. And what is that purpose? That you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. Early on in the Christian church, you were most likely going to encounter the gospel the way that most people do. Word of mouth. Someone comes to you, they preach. Right? Someone, fairly often we see the early apostles standing on a corner or in a place that was known for having speakers, and they preach. And you hear the word. And you accept that this person, Jesus, actually is who these preachers, who these teachers say that he is. But you might not know much beyond that, right? You kind of are taking them on their word. You're taking the demonstration of the Spirit's power for what it is, but you don't know the background, right? There's gaps there. So what Luke is doing here is he's writing this orderly account. He's taking all these details from these teachers, these eyewitnesses, and he's putting them together in a structured way for a very particular purpose, to give certainty for those who have entered into the faith. The things that they have been taught about the gospel, that there can be background to that there can be roots and a foundation. And in saying that, Luke is not only telling us why it's important to read things like the account he is putting together here in Luke and the one that he puts together in the book of Acts. What he's really telling us here is why it's so important to read Scripture. Right? This isn't just about the book of Acts, or the book of Luke. It's not just that Luke provides something that can give us certainty concerning the things we've been taught, but the entirety of Scripture does the same. And it does actually more than that. So if we want to think about, well, what do I do with this knowledge, right? We would think of, there's not much application that you can take away from the introduction to the book of Luke. Well, if you thought that, you are wrong. I've got 4 points for you. There's 4 things that reading Scripture does for us and that we should try to do, right? That we should look at our reading of Scripture as a preparation for these 4 particular things. And I realized as I was sitting there this morning that, I don't know how good everyone's Chinese is, but you could even think of these by 4 different terms. 1 is 我, 2 is 内, 3 is, the third one is 外, and then the 4th one is 下. So it's like for me, for those inside the church, for those outside the church, and then for the next generation. So the first one is exactly what Luke has been telling us. We read Scriptures so that we can shore up our certainty about the things that we've been taught. It's by reading Scripture that we know more about who Jesus is and how the church of which we are a part came to be. The second thing is that we can, like Paul writes in Ephesians, know that we no longer should be children tossed to and fro by the waves carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness in deceitful schemes. This is a way that you have certainty about the things you have been taught, not only so that you know that they are true, but that you can then defend yourself against bad teaching, bad intentions, and deceitful schemes. This is one where, I don't know, watching U.S. politics and the way that a lot of evangelicals have responded, it just is depressing because we're failing rather radically on this point in particular. But it is a way then not only of kind of firmly rooting your faith in and for yourself, but then defends you against any kind of crazy talk from outside. Or for crazy talk kind of within the church. Because the crazy talk can come from within the church. I see this happen way too often. My particular favorite is where people get way too overzealous about overinterpreting every little detail about Revelation. When that starts, it's like, okay, we got time out. Like, let's not go crazy on this. Let's just stick to what we know. But it helps protect us in that way as well. Another reason we read Scripture, we want to develop that certainty about the things we've been taught, is so that we can give a defense outside the church. Right? That people are going to ask you, like Peter reminds us, about the hope that is in us. Right? Hopefully, people, when they see the work of Christ in your life, that they're going to have questions. Hopefully they're good questions, not like the doubtful questions, like, you're a Christian, really? Hopefully it's the good questions. It's like, wow, tell me about this Jesus thing. He's changed your life. That you'll have an answer to that, right? That you'll have an answer to that. And that you can provide a defense. This is actually, again, looking historically, one of the many of the very first documents that we see come out of the church are defenses, right? Defenses against pagan authors who were attacking the church. Defenses against the philosophers who were trying to undermine the thinking of the Gospels. That they were defensive writings. Some of them were defensive writings within the church too. But that's another important use or reason why we read the Scriptures. And then the fourth one, the last one, is so that we also can teach what accounts for sound doctrine. And this is really important. Right? Luke, when he writes this, is able to say, those other eyewitnesses that you know of, right? That some of them were still alive at the time he's writing it. They were still there, right? So if you had doubts, you could go to them and ask them and be like, did these things really happen? Like, yes, they really happened, just like I told you last time. But that's not always true, right? We were a long way from first century Rome, right? We were a long way from when Luke actually wrote these things, right? We're a long way from even things like the Roman Empire, right? Rome rose, fell, became Renaissance Europe and fell, and then we're a long way from this stuff. So one of the reasons that we need these types of accounts and we need ourselves to read the Scriptures so that we can accurately, forcefully, with the most certainty that we can possibly develop and establish, that we can teach others the things that accord with sound doctrine. And in that way, if we are able to do those things, that we will also be mimicking the example that we see here in Luke. All right. I'll go ahead and close here then with a prayer.